We know more about human psychology today than at any point in history. And yet, we use almost none of it to address America's most fundamental issue: cultural fragmentation at the psychological and philosophical level. That raises a fair question. What standard are we using to evaluate the ideas shaping our lives? This judgment, like any other serious judgment, requires a foundation. It requires a model, and this video seeks to establish exactly that. My goal here is to provide a comprehensive measuring stick, a way to evaluate whether the ideas shaping our discourse today rise to the level of development required to engage with America's rational foundations. The principles that define America, reason, individualism, and self-responsibility, are not just cultural preferences. They are chosen commitments grounded in psychological and philosophical development. That level of development isn't required of every person, but it must be present in the concepts and philosophies we elevate. Without those foundations, the values America's principles aim to uphold can't be properly understood, let alone defended. Some ideas we encounter in today's discourse are simply amoral, operating below the ethical threshold. Others, while rising to the level of ethics, do so from a collective premise that denies individual moral agency. As I intend to show here, as well as in future works, both of these approaches are incompatible with America's foundations. The distinction matters because ideas don't just reflect who we are, they shape who we aspire to become. What follows is a meta-model, an integrative framework built from enduring systems of thought developed by experts in their respective fields. These are ideas from brilliant minds whose models of development, psychology, and meaning have sustained across time and disciplines. And in a culture overwhelmed by shallow takes and reactionary politics, we need that kind of depth now more than ever. None of these principles, reason, civilization, or the kind of freedom we prize in America, the freedom of the rational individual, arise automatically. These ideals depend on human development, and that development follows a pattern. Different disciplines have mapped that pattern. Jung through individuation, Keagan through stages of adult development, Fromm through the psychological tension between freedom and conformity, and Rand through the volitional demands of conceptual consciousness. Even Christianity points to the same transformation, though mostly in mystical terms. So, I've laid them side by side, layered them, not because they contradict, but because they converge. Each system speaks a different language, but they describe the same shift. By integrating their terms, I'm able to add depth and texture to an essential transformation made visible through different disciplines. That not only strengthens the model, it helps me speak to different kinds of minds all at once. In doing this, I also aim to expose something that goes often unnoticed. Most of the voices we hear commenting on what America should do, in politics, in culture, in leadership, are still theorizing from the mid to lower levels of human development. While these thinkers may offer immense value in terms of their descriptive insights, their ideas often fall short of being aligned with or practical within the ethical and political framework that America requires. Let's walk through the model, and we'll start with Jung. His system gives us the cleanest structure to begin with. Carl Jung was a Swiss psychiatrist, 1875 to 1961, and the founder of analytical psychology. Between 1913 and 1950, he developed influential theories on archetypes, the collective unconscious, and psychological types. His ideas laid the foundation for modern personality theory and continue to shape both clinical practice and popular understanding of how people orient themselves to the world. Now, to be clear, I don't think Jung himself was laying out a developmental arc from irrational to rational. His goal was to name and categorize the different ways people relate to the world. But when I interpret his system through a historical lens, not just psychological type, but the trajectory of human civilization, what I see is an implicit path, a movement from sensation and unconscious reaction toward judgment, reflection, and integration. That's what he calls individuation. You begin life dominated by what you sense or feel. Only later do you start to think about it, judge it, make decisions about it. That movement from perception to judgment, from instinct to reason, is where human development begins. Jung's own words point to this transformation. In describing the extroverted irrational types, he wrote,
"Their perception is directed simply and solely to events as they happen, no selection being made by judgment. These types are, by their very nature, irrational, not because they are unreasonable, but because they subordinate judgment to perception. They base themselves exclusively on experience, so exclusively that, as a rule, their judgment cannot keep pace with their experience."
We see something slightly different in the introverted irrational types. Their orientation turns inward, not toward events, but toward subjective experience. They are often misunderstood, in part because they misunderstand themselves. Jung says
they lack judgment and are powerless to understand why they are so constantly underestimated. Their inner life is rich, even captivating, but their communication is fragmented and unclear. From the outside, they can seem lost in imagination, incapable of translating their vision into anything useful. From an extroverted and rationalistic standpoint, these types are indeed the most useless of men.
Yet, he also acknowledges their cultural value.
In their own way, they are educators and promoters of culture. Their lives point to the richness of interiority.
But without reason and the ethics of reason, they too remain below the threshold of ethical agency. Next, we come to the extroverted rational types. Here, judgment takes the lead. Jung describes these types as
guided by reasoning and judging functions, giving their lives an outward order that aligns with socially accepted standards, but their rationality is object-dependent. They align themselves with collective norms and accepted truths, not internal principle. Their conduct accords with what is collectively considered to be rational, and their repression of irrational impulses makes them vulnerable to unconscious forces when those impulses eventually surface.
This is a significant point in our development line. They are rational, but their rationality is externalized, shaped by social expectations. This makes them appear developed, even responsible, but their judgment is not truly independent. Finally, we reach the introverted rational types. Like their extroverted counterparts, they are ruled by judgment, but theirs is turned inward. Their rationality is shaped by subjective data, not collective norms. Jung explains,
while proper rationality balances objective and subjective sources, the introverted rational type privileges internal premises, often without realizing it. This leads to a chain of reasoning that can feel valid to the type, but diverges from commonly accepted standards, sometimes dramatically so. This inner orientation, while potentially insightful, can also isolate the type, making them prone to self-doubt or egotism when their view conflicts with the world around them.
Developmentally, this stage reveals that rationality grounded in subjectivity is a powerful turning point, one where internal conviction takes precedence over collective norms, but where integration with reality remains essential. It's a critical phase in our continuum, where self-authorship emerges but still requires the discipline of objective validation to achieve a proper balance. Robert Keagan is a developmental psychologist and longtime professor at Harvard's Graduate School of Education, where he taught from the 1970s through the early 2000s. His most influential work, including The Evolving Self, 1982, and In Over Our Heads, 1994, presents a theory of adult development, describing how individuals evolve through increasingly complex stages of meaning-making and self-understanding. Keagan's work maps the psychological shifts that make rational agency possible, not through personality type, but through these stage phases of adult development. His most important insight is this:
we are not born with a self capable of objective thought. That capacity develops slowly, in phases.
The mechanism is what he calls the subject-object shift. At lower stages, we are fused with our beliefs, desires, and social roles. We are them. But as we develop, we gain distance. We start to have beliefs, rather than be them. And with that shift comes a new responsibility: ownership. What we have, we can examine. What we own, we are accountable for. That's the difference between being controlled by a concept and choosing it. This shift isn't merely cognitive, it's existential. We move from living inside our conditioning to authoring our own framework for life. Keagan outlines 5 major stages of adult development. Stage 1.
Pure subjectivity. The self is fused with reflexes and sensations. There is no real distinction between experience and identity. Stage 2. Impulsive and egocentric. The self is defined by needs and impulses, with limited awareness of others' perspectives. Stage 3. The socialized mind. The majority of adults plateau here. Beliefs and identity are shaped by external authority, family, culture, religion. Morality is received, not chosen. Stage 4. The self-authoring mind. Internal authority emerges. Individuals begin to define themselves through self-chosen values, ideologies, and goals. They are capable of principled independence. Stage 5. The self-transforming mind. Identity becomes fluid. Individuals can hold multiple perspectives, embrace contradiction, and remain psychologically flexible.
I have my questions whether this level represents real development or simply the dissolution of self, but I'll set that aside for now and return to it later. In our model, the socialized mind, stage 3, roughly corresponds to Jung's extroverted rational types, externally rational but not independently so. Stage 4 is where moral agency, as we mean it in a rational political system, begins. A person at this level does not simply follow rules. They create them, take responsibility for them, and assess external rules against their own rational framework before accepting or rejecting them. The next thinker in our synthesis marks a critical juncture where we start transitioning from psychological development to philosophical orientation. Erich Fromm, 1900 to 1980, was a German-born psychoanalyst, social psychologist, and philosopher associated with the Frankfurt School. Writing largely in the 1940s and 1950s, including his seminal work Escape from Freedom, 1941, Fromm explored how modern individuals avoid freedom and responsibility by merging with authority and the collective. He viewed this dynamic as central to both personal dysfunction and the psychological roots of totalitarianism. His work follows naturally from Jung and Keagan, showing not how development advances, but how it breaks down when the demands of freedom become too great. If Jung and Keagan show us how psychological structure forms, Fromm shows us how it can collapse, not just personally, but politically. His insights help diagnose what happens when people abandon the struggle for self-authorship and instead seek safety and external control. That's not just immaturity, it's a moral failure with real consequences. Fromm's concept of freedom from versus freedom to reveals a pivotal fork in development.
Many escape constraint but never build authorship. They achieve separation but not direction.
And this distinction mirrors a deeper psychological divide, the difference between living instinctually and living consciously. Fromm often contrasted human potential with the condition of lower animals, creatures bound to instinct, never individuated. But he didn't just draw a line between man and animal, he also traced a progression within humanity. In earlier periods of history, such as the medieval era, individual freedom wasn't yet a value. People didn't seek self-authorship. They aspired to belong to a collective whole. In Fromm's telling,
freedom and individuality weren't always assumed to be goods. They had to be discovered, then chosen.
This adds depth to our model. It reminds us that what we now call individual freedom and the psychological development that supports it is not a given. It's a historical achievement and one that remains fragile. Fromm shows us that
even today, people often regress from authorship back to conformity, from freedom to control.
In that sense, he adds weight to Jung's framework. It's not enough to perceive and react. Without judgment and moral authorship, we are free only in form, not in function. Ayn Rand, 1905 to 1982, was a Russian-American novelist and philosopher who developed the philosophy of objectivism. While her most influential novels, The Fountainhead, 1943, and Atlas Shrugged, 1957, popularized her ideas, it is her nonfiction works, such as The Virtue of Selfishness, 1964, and Philosophy, Who Needs It, 1982, that she most clearly articulated her ethical and epistemological system. Rand argued that reason, individualism, and capitalism are moral imperatives, and she framed rational self-interest as the foundation of a free and ethical society. While Jung and Keagan map the development of psychological structure, and Fromm exposes its failure modes, Rand introduces a clear bifurcation in cognitive orientation. She distinguishes between those who operate on a perceptual level of consciousness, which she often calls the anti-conceptual mentality or animal's consciousness, and those who function on the conceptual level of consciousness, which she recognizes as distinctly human. This distinction maps cleanly onto the earlier conversations about irrational types. Rand's perceptual types do not value ideas as such. They respond to the concrete and the immediate, often absorbing the norms or behaviors of others without integrating or challenging them. They are not merely immature or underdeveloped. They reject the need for concepts. This puts them in direct opposition to what Rand calls a conceptual consciousness, which actively seeks integration, abstraction, and principled thinking. It is only at this conceptual level that one can generate values, not just emotional preferences, but consciously chosen standards of action. In Rand's framing, the failure to conceptualize is not just a cognitive limitation, it's a moral one. It reflects the abdication of reason, the only means of achieving objectivity. Thus, the conceptual consciousness is not merely more advanced, it is more moral, because it treats ideas as tools of survival and independence, rather than as floating abstractions or social decorations. This commitment to conceptual thought isn't only visible in one's explicit philosophy. It reveals itself in what Rand calls a psychoepistemology, the habitual method by which one processes information and reaches conclusions. A rational psychoepistemology values clarity, integration, and non-contradiction. An irrational one avoids abstraction, leans on emotional association, or seeks cognitive shortcuts that bypass volitional thought. And beneath even that lies what Rand termed a sense of life, a preconceptual emotional orientation toward existence. While not a substitute for philosophy, it colors how a person experiences the world and responds to it. It is the emotional residue of one's implicit metaphysics, shaped by repeated choices to engage or evade reality. This gives us another way to tie Rand's framework into the earlier thinkers. The sense of life orientation of her perceptual and anti-conceptual mentalities align closely with Jung's irrational types in Keagan's first two stages, where perception dominates judgment and subjectivity lacks reflection. By contrast, her conceptual consciousness shares a deep affinity with Jung's rational types and Keagan's self-authoring mind, where judgment becomes volitional, values are consciously chosen, and internal principles govern behavior. In all cases, the ability to abstract and the decisions to do so marks the shift from passive reaction to moral agency. These layers help complete Rand's contribution to our model. Conceptual consciousness isn't just a faculty, it's a discipline. It produces values, selects methods of thinking, and forms the emotional atmosphere in which a person lives. In that sense, her framework affirms and extends our earlier insight. Development is not just structural or emotional, it is volitional. The conceptual mind must be chosen. Leonard Peikoff, Ayn Rand's intellectual heir, who taught philosophy and lectured extensively from the 1960s through the early 2000s, sharpens the evaluative clarity of our framework. While most of his work systematizes objectivism, one of his most helpful contributions lies in his distinction between integrated, misintegrated, and disintegrated ideas. Integrated ideas are logically consistent and connected to reality. Misintegrated ideas are orderly but built on false premises. Disintegrated ideas are fragmented, lacking coherence or direction. This typology offers an additional diagnostic tool for our model. It does not describe stages of development, but rather states of conceptual alignment. When applied to the systems we've traced, from Jung's psychological types to Rand's psychoepistemology, Peikoff's distinction helps us assess whether a given worldview is healthy, distorted, or fractured. In this way, he offers us a precise evaluative lens, not how developed an idea is, but how well-formed and ethically grounded it has become. Christianity, while not a psychological system, offers one of the oldest moral frameworks still active in our culture. Its language is spiritual, but its message mirrors the same arc we've traced across psychological development. The human being must undergo a transformation, dying to a lower, instinct-driven, hedonistic self and being reborn into a higher self capable of rational judgment, moral clarity, and self-restraint. What Christianity frames as a spiritual rebirth closely parallels the psychological shift from unreflective impulse to conscious authorship. This connection may explain Christianity's historical alignment with the rise of education, literacy, and moral law, as the reborn individual must learn, understand, and grow. In that sense, Christianity articulates in mystical terms what our psychological models describe explicitly. A threshold must be crossed to live not just instinctually, but ethically and collectively. Up to this point, we've presented this model horizontally, moving thinker by thinker, retracing the same line of development. But that line that we've been following, it was never just a line, it's something deeper. What we've really been uncovering isn't just a sequence, it's a hierarchy. This is where Abraham Maslow offers a helpful visual. While not central to our framework, Maslow's well-known pyramid, his hierarchy of needs, illustrates something deeper than motivation. It shows that development is layered, not linear. The higher depends on the lower. Each stage rests on the integration of the one beneath it. What we've been tracking, from sensation to judgment, from instinct to authorship, isn't just a path, it's a structure. A foundation rising towards conscious moral agency. The base isn't discarded, it's transformed. But it also must be remembered. Growth is not about transcending the lower levels and forgetting them. That's a perilous distortion. But neither is growth possible when we refuse to pursue the higher levels out of comfort or fear. One mistake abandons our foundation, the other avoids our potential. True development means integration, carrying forward what is essential while reaching upward toward what is possible. And our highest capacities, reason, independence, responsibility, stand not in opposition to our nature, but on top of it. In that sense, Maslow's pyramid becomes a metaphor for everything we've just uncovered, a human hierarchy of psychological and ethical development. And this brings us to why it matters. When I judge modern philosophers, I'm not doing it casually. I'm looking at where they are in this structure. Are they still driven by emotional reaction? Are they embedding themselves in collective identity? Are they avoiding personal authorship? Are they refusing the responsibility of reason? This model helps us recognize that the psychological development of a person mirrors, and fast forward, the psychological development of human history. Civilization took thousands of years to reach the kind of ethical and conceptual clarity we now expect of individuals. That means we had the tools to accelerate that journey, to help someone develop in years what took humanity centuries. But only if we hold our philosophy to the appropriate standard. We must use what we know about psychology to recognize that while many individuals may not reach the highest stages of development, and that's to be expected, the ideas we accept and elevate in public discourse must. The standard isn't for every person to be fully developed, but for the concepts and philosophies they present to rise to the level required by America's rational foundations. When they don't, those ideas are by definition amoral. They may sound convincing or feel urgent, but they are not reasoning ethically. They are reacting emotionally or conforming socially. In a rational and individualistic country like what America was designed to be, true leadership requires more than emotion or intellect. It requires ethical self-awareness, a stable relationship to reality, an understanding of principles, not just opinions. A collectivized, reactive mind cannot understand the free, rational individual, and so it cannot sustain or even successfully defend a society built on that ideal. The difference matters. Ideas can and must be judged by their structure, their level of integration, and their alignment with reality. Evaluating people by this standard can be misleading. However, evaluating ideas by this standard is essential. That's what this framework is designed to do. Not to determine who is good or bad, but to clarify what kinds of ideas are worthy of shaping America's culture. It allows us to judge ideas by their structure, their level of integration, and their alignment with reality, not by who says them, but by what they represent. Some ideas have reached that level, and others have not. This isn't about condemning the people who hold them, but about clarifying the standards we apply. Because not every idea belongs in every conversation, especially when the stakes are civilization itself. Come back to this, rewatch it, share it, study it. Because if we want to repair what's broken in culture, in politics, in ourselves, we have to see it clearly. And seeing it clearly begins with one thing: knowing how to judge.